Hey everybody, this is the last chapter of Iring Fetscher's book, Marx and Marxism. It's titled The Historical Preconditions of Socialism. Karl Marx was the first writer to state that there are specific, quote, historical preconditions, end quote, for the achievement of socialism. Marx repeatedly contradicted the absolute revolutionary postulates, absolute, in that those postulates are not related to a particular period in history, in particular of the anarchists, by drawing attention to the need for certain historical conditions to be met before a socialist revolution can be successfully implemented. On the other hand, it has been shown, indeed Friedrich Engels did not hesitate to confess the fact openly, that Marx and Engels were unable to define precise criteria for the degree of, quote, maturity, end quote, which a society must attain before it is ready to undergo a socialist transformation. We must, however, attempt to formulate, at least in broad outline, the objective economic and political and subjective psychological and organizational requirements which allow socialism to be achieved in the eyes of Marx and Engels. Moreover, since 1917, quote, socialist revolutions have been implemented in a number of states, and we must therefore also ask whether the conditions, historical preconditions, which existed in those particular countries coincided with those foreseen by Marx and Engels, or to what extent it has been found that a successful socialist revolution can take place as well under very different conditions. Finally, we must examine what form the socialist society would take according to Marx and Engels, and what form the countries which have lived through a socialist revolution in fact take. Digressing from the line of thought which I have outlined above, I should, however, like to begin by defining what Marx understood by socialism. In this context, reference may also be made to the works of Danko Grulich and Mihailo Markovich. I have two pieces at least, by Mihailo Markovich on this channel. Markovich on this channel. One is from Erich Fromm's Socialist Humanism Compendium, and the other, I'll be out. The other is from what the hell is it called? Life Without Money, the edited volume by Anitra Nelson. I have a piece from him from that. But I do not know who this Danko Grulich person is. Wikipedia says that Danko Grulich was a Marxist humanist, a member of the Praxis School of the SFR Yugoslavia. It says his major works. Grulich represented critical Marxist positions typical for the whole Praxis school. After Marx, Grulich's favorite author was Friedrich Nietzsche. He wanted to overcome the negative image of Nietzsche in Marxist cycles, claiming that the Nazis' version of Nietzsche's thought wasn't the essence of his thought. The major field of scientific interest of Grulich was aesthetics. He is the author of a 4-volume study of aesthetics published in the period between 1974 and 1979. Other works include Dictionary of Philosophers, 1968, Contra Dogmaticos, 1971, Friedrich Nietzsche, 1981, The Challenge of the Negative to the Aesthetics of Theodor Adorno, 1986, posthumous. Section 1. What is socialism? Perhaps we can best embark upon a definition of what Marx implied by a socialist society by first examining inadequate and excessively narrow definitions. A society in which private ownership of the major means of production has been abolished, and which therefore allows a planned development of the productive forces, cannot yet be defined as socialist. In the age of Stalinism, socialism was frequently conceived in this narrow perspective. For Marx and Engels, however, the abolition of private ownership of the means of production, or expressed in positive terms, the socialization of ownership of the means of production, was only one means of altering relationships between men and enabling individuals to develop individuals' full talents. The transition from the capitalist economy of competition or monopolies to the socialist economy was intended to alter the relationships between men in such a way that they no longer looked upon each other as means but as brothers and sisters linked by solidarity and complementing one another. The class war and struggle between egoistic individuals was to be replaced without any form of education, quote, from above, end quote, by the state, by a voluntary community of fully developed, rich, varied, and happy individuals. The justification for the violent efforts of the revolution was not seen in the, quote, filthy materialistic, end quote, economy, but in the foundation of a human society in which all the values which are simply propagated by the bourgeoisie would in fact be achieved, a society of true freedom, equality, and brotherly love. If Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels declined to propagate and formulate this new social order as a, quote, ideal, and if Marx and Engels always spoke out strongly against all forms of ethical and religious socialism, Marx and Engels did not do so because such a society seemed to them to have no greater moral value than a capitalist society, but simply because the purely moral demand, the edifying reflection on one's own goodwill to bring about an improvement without practical action, seemed valueless to them. The aversion which Marx and Engels felt for political moralism was fed by two historical sources, Hegel's critical realism and the positivism of the second half of the 19th century. It is one of the urgent requirements of research into the work of Karl Marx to analyze this heterogeneous combination of the, quote, absolute knowledge, end quote, of Hegel with the concept of science held by natural scientists, a combination of which presumably neither Marx nor Engels was fully aware. To my mind, however, it is quite certain that today, reference to the moral character and higher human value of a socialist society is at least as much justified as the critical rejection of every form of moralizing socialism once was. Forms of ethical socialism which overlook the concrete socio-economic preconditions for social change and in the last resort merely aim to achieve a sentimental satisfaction of personal moral feelings. This earlier risk has, however, of course, disappeared. It consisted in being content with mere protest, with verbal condemnation of, quote, moral deficiency, end quote, and equally verbal glorification of the, quote, good socialist, end quote, society. The formulation of moral value judgments almost always has the psychological side effect that the person who formulates them is more than satisfied with his own standards. The concern, quote, for one's own good soul, end quote, rather than for the creation of objective conditions of a, quote, good life, end quote, for everyone is condemned by Marx not only from a rational scientific standpoint, but also for specifically moral reasons. But I have dwelled too long on this aspect. For my present purpose, it will be sufficient to note that in the eyes of Marx and Engels, the socialist society was not only characterized by a specific system of ownership, but above all by the effects which it was expected to have. According to the concept which any particular grouping has of a socialist society, so it will also answer the question of the, quote, historical preconditions of socialism, end quote. There is, however, a mutual dependence between the concept of socialism and historical conditions. Under specific historico-social conditions, the concept of socialism is modified consciously or unconsciously. If a political group intends to organize a revolution in its country and wishes to use the impressive name of socialism for this revolution, it will be sure to alter the idea of socialism either at once or in the later course of reconstruction, in such a way that it coincides with the social reality of the new society. Otherwise, and this too occurs from time to time, it will have to define a social reality as socialist in the sense characterized above by Marx and Engels, which in fact has quite different main features. In this case, the notion of the, quote, socialist society, end quote, would have become an ideology in the negative sense of the word. Section 2, Marx and Engels. 1. An appropriate degree of, quote, maturity, end quote, must be achieved, that is, advanced bourgeois industrial society. It did prove difficult, if not impossible, to define this degree accurately. At any rate, after 1848, Marx repeatedly counted upon the early onset of adequate historical preconditions for a socialist revolution. This, quote, maturity would be characterized on the one hand by a specific technical level of development of the means of production and on the other by an appropriate social transformation, proletarianization of the petit bourgeois and peasant population, concentration of capital and so forth, and the predominance of a capitalist market economy. In other words, society must be technically, socially, and economically mature for the transformation. Marx assumed in this context that the economic structure would soon prove to be a factor inhibiting further technical progress and lead to a continuous heightening of the contrast between a class of capitalists which would grow smaller and at the same time richer, coupled with the growing mass of members of the industrial proletariat. 2. The second condition for the possibility of a socialist transformation is contained within the first. It consists in the existence of a sufficiently strong, how strong, industrial proletariat, which Marx assumed was the only class that as such could have an essential interest in a radical socialist transformation. Whatever additional forces might join this revolutionary class, the leadership should lie solely with the industrial proletariat. 3. The existence of a massive industrial proletariat on its own would not, however, suffice in conjunction with the objective conditions for a socialist revolution mentioned in 1 above to bring about such a revolution. A third factor is indispensable, namely this revolutionary class consciousness which Marx assumed would soon be acquired by the proletariat once the latter became aware of its own position. This consciousness of its own class position should, however, never coincide. I don't know why I said never. This consciousness of its own class position should, however, coincide or indeed be identical with the constitution of the proletariat into a class that is a community able to achieve political action. While the, quote, class in itself, end quote, is furnished by history, its transformation into a class, quote, for itself, end quote, must be brought about by an additional act of consciousness and will. This act would, however, be promoted or at least facilitated by the objective impoverishment of the proletariat and periodic crises, the brunt of which must be borne by the industrial proletariat. The 3 historical preconditions for a socialist transformation are therefore as follows, according to Marx: a certain degree of industrial and economic maturity in the developed capitalist society, an industrial proletariat with sufficient strength, and an appropriate political class consciousness. All 3 requirements, which form a closely related complex, cannot be quantified precisely. They are parameters which can be accurately defined only by historical experience. These historical preconditions, however, conceal greater complexity than first meets the eye and then was expressly formulated by Marx and Engels. If, in fact, the socialist revolution and the socialist society which it inaugurates can result only from a capitalist bourgeois society which has achieved the appropriate degree of maturity, it will necessarily also be the heir to the progressive traditions of this society, in particular the bourgeois revolution and the bourgeois enlightenment. Marx and Engels are both so closely associated with progressive bourgeois traditions that it seemed to them quite superfluous to emphasize these traditions. The freedom and dignity of the individual, his equality with all other members of society, his right to free development and to appropriate participation in the shaping of social life were all taken for granted in the bourgeois, liberal, and democratic tradition. Marx never criticized these ideas as such, but simply drew attention to the fact that they cannot be generally achieved so long as the capitalist system of property ownership is maintained, but must remain ideological veils behind which a reality is concealed which conflicts with the proper ideals of bourgeois society. Section 3. Lenin and Leninism. There can be no doubt that Lenin's intention was simply to apply the thought developed by Marx, as I have attempted to summarize it, to the changed conditions of the 20th century and in particular to Russian society. Lenin tried to retain as much of Marx's original thought as possible and to keep modifications within tight limits. I will try to formulate in a somewhat simplified way how the 3 aspects of the historical preconditions for socialism are changed in Lenin's revolutionary publications. 1. Lenin felt that the degree of maturity of capitalist industrial society had long been reached on the general world scale. Lenin felt that in the highly industrialized countries such as Great Britain, the USA, Germany, France, Belgium, the objective conditions for a proletarian socialist revolution had existed for a long time. For specific reasons, however, which are developed in detail in his theory of imperialism, he assumed that the chances for a revolution, but only for a revolution as such, and certainly not for the underlying socialist transformation, had moved away from the industrialized center to the periphery of the worldwide capitalist system. James D. White criticizes the notion that Lenin adopted the weakest link in the chain idea. But
For our purposes, let's continue. I can't elaborate on that. I think it was actually Plekhanov who held to the weakest link in the chain theory, and then it was kind of like incorporated into like Marxist-Leninist dogma. But I think people have said. I think James D. White says that Lenin never actually had that position, but I'm not sure. The, quote, initial spark, end quote, for the world revolution might well and even probably would come from the, quote, weakest link in the chain, end quote, and not from the highly industrialized countries themselves. Lenin therefore adhered firmly to Marx's notion that a specific level of industrial and economic maturity is necessary for implementing a socialist revolution, but with the help of his theory of imperialism, he was able to combine Marx's concept with the possibility of the outbreak of the revolution in a relatively backward agrarian country such as Russia. It was, however, also necessary for this purpose to modify considerably the second aspect of the historical preconditions of the proletarian socialist revolution. 2. Since in the countries on the periphery of the worldwide capitalist system, the industrial proletariat was not a sufficiently strong social group, revolution could have a chance of success only if a revolutionary elite managed to direct heterogeneous groups, all dissatisfied with the political and social status quo, towards this single aim. The need was therefore present to replace, at least for the time being, the industrial proletariat by a new type of party which would have the task of recruiting masses for the revolution from the petit bourgeois, the peasants and the intellectuals, and which would take the place of the revolutionary class, at least in its function and soon also in its self-awareness. For Marx, too, the constitution of an actual revolutionary party was decisive, but while with Marx the class is constituted with the help of the party as a conscious historical subject, in the case of Lenin, the party based on heterogeneous elements constituted a substitute for the missing revolutionary class. 3. Consequently, the third aspect is also fundamentally modified. The revolutionary class consciousness need not be present in a large industrial proletariat. It is sufficient for it to have taken on form among the political elite, the, quote, party of a new type, end quote. The political class consciousness is now therefore detached from its social substrate and becomes a characteristic for the organized minority which lays claim to leadership functions. The latter can no longer be satisfied with arousing, quote, appropriate, end quote, class consciousness in the industrial proletariat and proclaiming the state of consciousness which is appropriate for the objective class position, but becomes the, quote, leader and educator of the masses, end quote, this technical term comprising, of course, the entire heterogeneous basis of recruitment for the revolutionary army. Section 4. Potential and real forms of socialism. On the basis of this simplified outline, I shall now consider what has been achieved in the name of socialism and what Marx and Engels implied by Marx and Engels, quote, socialist society, end quote. First of all, it is easy to see that the historical preconditions described by Marx and Engels were perhaps present in large measure for a considerable length of time, but for a number of reasons were not used to bring about deep revolutionary changes in industrial society. Since the last worldwide economic crisis was overcome, the highly industrialized societies have evidently developed an arsenal of economic and regulative means which prevent serious crises from arising, and in addition, these countries are able, through their technologically based wealth, to offer such a high standard of living to the working class that there no longer seems to be a sufficient cause for revolutionary change. The far more complex phenomenon of social reforms within highly industrialized societies is naturally linked, among other factors, with the existence of the Soviet Union and the, quote, socialist camp, end quote, which forces every bourgeois government to make certain, not inconsiderable efforts in the area of the welfare of its citizens. It may be that, for example, between 1910 and 1930, an objective revolutionary situation existed to the extent that the conditions referred to under 1 and 2 above were largely fulfilled. However, if the corresponding revolutionary consciousness was lacking, this will be attributed, according to the individual standpoint, to defects in the reformist revisionist theory, to the absence of political will to succeed on the part of socialist politicians, to the strength of nationalism, or also, since 1917, to splits within the workers' movement. There can, however, be no doubt that the, quote, victory, end quote, of socialism in backward Russia did more harm than good to the chances of a socialist revolution in the industrial Western countries. Indirectly and unintentionally, the victory of Lenin's party led to a stabilization of capitalism by encouraging the leading circles in the industrialized capitalist nations faced with the crisis of 1929, and also since that date to avoid a similar fate in their own country by socio-political measures, or fascism, and also by bringing about splits within the revolutionary workers' movement. The socialism which Marx felt was possible and wished to see implemented therefore failed to materialize. It can scarcely be assumed that it will ever be achieved under the conditions which Marx had anticipated. Instead, socialism first won the day in an isolated, albeit very large country, the Soviet Union. The position which Lenin theoretically considered impossible in fact occurred, that is, no world revolution followed the initial spark of 1917 in the highly industrialized countries. The displacement of the center of revolutionary gravity into these countries, which Lenin had felt to be inevitable, therefore remained impossible. And the Soviet Union was alone. Stalin developed the theory of the possibility of development of socialism in one country. Hold on. There's a storm outside. I gotta close the windows. Yeah, I got it. Yeah. One second, sorry. Alright. Storm coming. Or storm happening. Where am I? The position which Lenin theoretically considered impossible in fact occurred, that is, no world revolution followed the initial spark of 1917 in the highly industrialized countries. The displacement of the center of revolutionary gravity into these countries, which Lenin had felt to be inevitable, therefore remained impossible, and the Soviet Union was alone. Stalin developed the theory of the possibility of development of socialism in one country. This theory was necessary if the dominant position of his party was to be maintained even after the failure of the world revolution. The authorization of a return to capitalism, even if only in the controlled form of the, quote, new economic policy, unquote, appeared unacceptable as a permanent solution, at least to the members of this new political class which had taken the helm of Soviet society. If, however, the type of society which was built up in the Soviet Union since the early 1930s was to be defined as socialist, it became necessary, that is, for the ideologists of the Soviet Communist Party, either to modify the notion of socialism in such a way that it coincided with Soviet reality, or else to develop the theory into an ideology behind which a totally different reality was concealed. It was in fact neither to be expected nor hoped that under conditions which differed so markedly from those defined by Marx, a form of socialism would arise which would coincide with that which he had hoped to see materialize. In practice, Soviet ideologists have wavered between the two possibilities for adapting theory to practice, or veiling practice behind theory, and have used both alternately. We find on the one hand in the literature of the Stalinist period a limitation of the notion of socialism to a society in which collective ownership of the means of production prevails and technical development advances rapidly, while on the other hand there is the dogmatic assertion of a harmonious society without inherent conflicts made up of classes, peoples, and individuals united in friendship. Both these elements did more harm than good to the cause of humanistic socialism or socialistic humanism. Humanistic socialism or socialist humanism. While the reduction of the socialist ideal to the achievement of ever-increasing economic targets defined in various plans will not impress any industrial worker in the West, the ideological concealment of poor conditions under socialist humanist phraseology repels the critical observer and may discredit the ideal itself in his eyes. Section 5. Future Prospects. Herbert Marcuse and Serge Millet examine the question of, quote, prospects for socialism in industrialized societies, end quote, and in the, quote, developing countries, end quote, in Corcula, reprinted in International Socialist Journal, Volume 2, Issue 8, April 1965. The call for a national movement of liberation in the Third World was accompanied by a hope which bore less conviction for a common revolution by the technocrats, and industrial workers in the West. I should like to add my own expression of a third modest hope. The hope that the errors and distortions of socialism may be overcome in the socialist countries themselves. Only when these societies and their political institutions can justly present themselves as the realization of those, quote, bourgeois, end quote, dreams of the future which have remained unfulfilled will they tend to attract humanist socialists instead of producing the opposite effect. The achievement of a high standard of living is certainly not the sole and urgent objective, even if it remains indispensable. For some years now, the socialist world has been living in a state of flux which has been heightened considerably by the Sino-Soviet conflict. We should perhaps not condemn this conflict excessively as long as it remains bloodless. Perhaps it will help to promote a process of theoretical and practical reform, growth to maturity, the ultimate result of which may resemble Marx's own vision of socialism to a rather greater extent than to those societies which today, often unjustly, call themselves, quote, socialist, end quote. The end. Thank you for listening.